Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I am Clay Jenkinson. You're getting a lot of the film Oppenheimer these days, very little on Barbie, although I am going to see it. My daughter has shamed me for not seeing them both on the same day, and she tells me that the Barbie film is significant. We'll see, right? I'm not afraid of it, but to put Oppenheimer, a tragic character who built a weapon of mass destruction, in the same equation as a plastic doll with oversized breasts seems a little perverse to me, but I get that we're living in a postmodern age, right? Anyway, I hope you agree that Oppenheimer is worth all this fuss. I've interviewed John Gowans twice now. He's the actor who plays Dr. Ward Evans, one of the three members of the panel that sat in judgment of Oppenheimer in the spring of 1954, after which his security clearance was withdrawn. I've interviewed, of course, the great David Nicandri. We saw it on the same day, and we both texted each other, "We must have a conversation." And, of course, then we did. And now I've interviewed Niles Schwartz. Niles has been a friend of mine now for a few years. At the pandemic, he was one of the people who joined several of my online courses. And in every course, he discussed cinema. You know, there are three words here, like movies, film, and then cinema. And Niles knows a great deal about the history of film, and he's an expert at it. I learn a great deal from him. I frequently write him a letter asking for lists of apocalyptic films, list of the greatest sci-fi films, list of the greatest romantic comedies, list of the greatest ancient epics about Rome and Israel, and Alexander the Great, and so on. And in this case, he's also provided me with a list of the great atomic films, of course, at the top of which is Dr. Strangelove, Stanley Kubrick's enormous satire, amazing satire for its time in the 1960s, and one of my favorite films. And by the way, in Oppenheimer, there is a tribute, after a fashion at least, to Dr. Strangelove. Edward Teller, at the atomic test on July 16, 1945, is seen slathering his face with suntan lotion. This is true, by the way. And then he puts on goggles, and when the bomb goes off, he says something close to wow. I mean, it's clearly not just impressed and stunned, but thrilled in a way. So he's clearly the Darth Vader of the story, and so Edward Teller is clearly the Dark Star, the Darth Vader of the atomic era. And it's clear that Christopher Nolan, the director, is referring, a wonderful little allusion to Peter Sellers as Dr. Strangelove in the film of that name. Niles is really an amazing person. He has a kind of a completely different public job in Minneapolis, Minnesota. But, you know, there are very few people that I know who really know film, who study film, who are film historians, who know the vocabulary of film. Can't wait to get to Minneapolis one of these days to have dinner with him and go to the Guthrie Theater, the famous Guthrie Theater of Minneapolis. I said I hope it will be a Shakespeare, but I'm open to all sorts of other possibilities too. I've never met Niles except in cyberspace, but when I saw the film for the second time on Sunday, the 23rd of July, I thought I need to contact Niles, because I keep thinking about this film in terms of its history, its historiography, its accuracy. Is it a compelling portrait of a tragic protagonist like J. Robert Oppenheimer? Why does it spend so much time on Louis Strauss? Are the multiple layers of the film? It's a study of Oppenheimer's life and achievement. It's a study of the making of the atomic bomb. It's a study of the security catastrophe that occurred to Oppenheimer in the early 1950s. And it's a study of fall of Louis Strauss, the Atomic Energy Commissioner, who was the nemesis of J. Robert Oppenheimer. So Christopher Nolan's trying to juggle a fair number of plates at the same time, and mostly I have focused on that. And then I thought, after coming out of it last time, the person to talk to is Niles. And I wrote to him, and he wrote back and said, "I was just about to contact you." He said, "I've been reading some of the stuff you've been writing about it. I think we should talk about it." And so we lined up our discussion. Really, this is what Zoom has done to the world. Before Zoom and after Zoom is really one of the pivots of my life. I now have the chance to interview scores of people from all over the country, all over the world, who are willing to step up to a screen, but would have a harder time getting themselves to a public radio station, and we'd have to pay for the access to it, and then we'd have to have them send the files and so on. This is a whole new technological era. You see it on the cable news channels, that during the pandemic suddenly allowed their talking heads to be anywhere. I have a photograph of J. Robert Oppenheimer up on the wall behind me, so I don't forget that this is a very, 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 very complicated and interesting man. So let's go to the show. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, my conversation with Niles Schwartz about Oppenheimer as cinema. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm really delighted to have sitting across from me virtually Niles Schwartz of the Twin Cities of Minnesota. Niles has been in a number of my online courses, and he always brings an extraordinary perspective in film, movies, and cinema to whatever we're talking about. And Niles, when I saw Oppenheimer the other day, I was the first person in my zip code to see it at noon on the 21st. I couldn't wait. As I came out of the theater, I thought, I got to call Niles, and I want to see, A, if he's seen it, and B, if he's willing to come on and talk about it. So you saw it right away, too.
I did. I saw the preview screening on the Thursday. I had bought my ticket for this IMAX showing probably a month and a half in advance. And then I saw it the next day in 70 millimeter.
You saw the full 70 millimeter.
Yeah, it isn't the 70 millimeter IMAX, which is the proper way to see the movie, but you can only see it that way, I think, in 30 locations in the world. I'm not sure. And in my younger days, I would have made the trek to Grand Rapids, Michigan, or Indianapolis. But logistically, I couldn't work that out, or not yet anyway. Maybe I will in the next month. We'll see.
We'll see. So first question, how much were you anticipating this film?
Very much. I admire the work of Christopher Nolan. I'm not a Nolan head, as they're called, because Nolan has his fan base thanks to the Batman movies and Inception and Interstellar and so on. But I'm also quite, in part thanks to you, I should say, a J. Robert Oppenheimer fan. I find him to be a fascinating person. I love the book American Prometheus, Pandora's Keepers, A Life in Twilight. And I find him to be such a fascinating subject for film because he's such a rich character. And also just the subject matter of the bomb and its implications, to say nothing of what happened to Oppenheimer after the bomb. I mean, reading American Prometheus, as I was reading that book, I saw 3 or 4 different movies in it. And then not half a year later, I think, Nolan announced that this is going to be his next feature film. And we are starved for big Hollywood movies about serious subjects, and he went all out on this. I mean, it's rated R, it's about a third in black and white, there's no action scenes. A studio exec is probably scratching their head and saying, so we're going to spend $150 million on this in this economy, in this environment, and dominated by intellectual property like Marvel movies or DC movies or sequels and so on and so forth. So I think we're starved for this kind of movie, and the Barbieheimer meme worked to get people interested. I think it was mutually beneficial for both movies. I saw a lot of people dressed in pink at my screen.
You weren't dressed in pink, however.
I wasn't dressed in pink, but there were groups of people dressed in pink, and other group, in the same group, there were people in suit and ties, and a lot of them were kids, college kids and some high school kids. Really looking forward to this movie, and I have to say, it delivered.
Yeah, so my area, as you know, is history. I portray Oppenheimer. He's my favorite character. I love the complexity of him. I love the brilliance of him. I love the ethical cauldron that he found himself in. I also love that he had this fall, that he's truly a tragic character in the old Aristotelian full sense of what a tragic protagonist is. I come at it with some interest, considerable interest in cinema, but not your interest. And so I'm so interested to talk about it in 2 different ways. One is Christopher Nolan took on a very big thing here. You talked about multiple stories. There are multiple stories. There's the story of the atomic bomb. There's the story of the life and psychology of this man, J. Robert Oppenheimer. There's the story of his security clearance ordeal in 1954 when his security clearance was stripped by the Atomic Energy Commission. And then there's the story of Louis Strauss, who, even in American Prometheus, is a relatively minor character in this story, but of course a major character in this film. So my first thought when I was watching the film was, I've read 100 books on this subject. I portrayed Oppenheimer 100 times. I've been to Alamogordo, I've been to Los Alamos, etc. I wondered if the average viewer found the multiple storylines, the black and white, the color, the cuts, confusing in any way, too abstract. What did you think?
I think what the movie succeeds at is in the abstract. You think you describe that, and no one will be able to keep up with this. No, it wasn't confusing at all. There is lots of, we'll call it lacunae in the picture. There's a lot of stuff,
which for the uninformed are holes in the thing.
Yeah, and that it's really fascinating, and it's sort of still structurally brilliant. To bring up one important scene, which could serve as sort of a guide or a reflection to how Nolan makes the whole picture. It's where he has his first sexual rendezvous with Jean Tatlock, played by
his communist girlfriend during his Berkeley years before he married Kitty.
Yes. And it's a sex scene, and she suddenly gets up and goes to the bookshelf and takes the Bhagavad Gita off the shelf and says, "Translate this for me." And he's just going to say, "Oh, this is where Vishnu," and she says, "No, no, 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 no." She doesn't want the context. She just wants the sheer translation. And he gives that famous, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." And, on its face, you could say, well, everyone's heard that as regards to Oppenheimer, but it's very interesting that in a film with so many scenes that we're not necessarily given context as to where this person was from. For example, the affair with Ruth Tolman.
You can miss that. It's possible to miss that in watching the film, but we know it happened. When I watched it the second time, it became more clear. But the first time, you almost want little balloon IDs of some of the characters, right?
Yeah, and it's just there, and it's left for us to. It's sort of hanging in the air in terms of, well, what's going on there? But that, to me, if a movie is compelling, actually makes it more engrossing. After the movie, you actually are wondering about this, and the fact of how this character compartmentalizes his life and that's an aspect of Oppenheimer as a man, which you could project onto his failings as a man and as a tragic character, as you say. When we think about his children and how they're sort of sidelined, they're compartmentalized, and not included in the film is what he said about his daughter Toni after she was born to his babysitter. "I don't think I could love her." And he's too busy.
Yeah, just to interrupt for a moment, Niles. So he had two children, Peter and Toni. Peter is still alive, lives quietly in New Mexico. His daughter Toni had lots of difficulties, committed suicide as a young woman in the Caribbean. Can't have been easy to be the children of the father of the atomic bomb, period. And then you have all the difficulties of family life and parenting in that household. That was a troubled household. So in this scene, Jean Tatlock and Robert Oppenheimer have just made love. You get the sense it's one of his first sexual experiences. She stands up, goes to the bookshelf, pulls out this volume. It's Sanskrit. The big line in the whole story is, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds," which he is said to have thought about when the bomb went off at Alamogordo on July 16th, 1945. Christopher Nolan wants to set that up, right? He wants to anticipate that in this moment so that when it actually comes, we're prepared for it, right? Because, or you tell me, why do you think he has that happen with Jean Tatlock? It felt a little artificial to me.
It did feel kind of contrived, but at the same time, I thought, she's the one who gets up and she gets the bookshelf and going again right after he translates it. And that sort of sets, that's the way the movie works, though. It's going and going and going, and then there's information, and okay, we're going some more, I guess. And it's always, the thing is it's never boring. And the whole sexual element, I think, creative element and destructive element is underlined the whole thing. And because yes, at that Trinity site, I guess spoilers, uh, we we hear that line of dialogue again in his mind, and this is after Jean Tatlock has taken her own life in 1943, of course. And I think that's also something that haunts Oppenheimer, by the way, of course.
But that tells you something about Nolan's integrity, because so much of the dialogue of the film, of the script, is taken directly from things we know are historically verified statements. And we know that he did not, at the test site, say, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." He said that in 1965 on the 20th anniversary. He said he was thinking about it. And we know that's probably not what he said to his brother Frank or anyone else on that occasion. But it shows the depth of his humanistic reading, and that this is how you do. You create narratives and place your life experience in the ways you have of seeing that come from experience and from books and from so on.
Yeah.
So I thought that worked. I really appreciated Nolan's integrity. In other words, my biggest concern going in was, here we go, Hollywood. And it wasn't. It wasn't a here we go Hollywood story at all, and it could have been. I thought they were going to sensationalize the Jean Tatlock story. They did not.
And where it goes after that, Jean Tatlock in 1954 in the hearing room.
When they're naked having sex in the hearing room.
He's exposed, and that's sort of, and that reminds me of your interview with John Gowans, because he was describing Florence Pugh being there, and I'm like, well, why would she be in that room? And the way that he was sort of laughing, it's like, I don't know how I could describe this. And seeing it afterwards, I listened to your interview after seeing the movie again, and it was so revealing about what went into that scene. But it's so appropriate, because what you're seeing is, as Kitty says after that interrogation, well, now it's on record for everybody. It's out in the open for everyone. As Robbie said, not in the film, but you are writing a man's life.
Yeah, so we need to take a short break here, Niles, but I take it that the scene in the hearing room where they're coupling, which of course didn't happen, but it's feeling exposed, having his life being, his clothes ripped off in a public place like that worked for you.
Yes, it did.
I found it a little artificial, again, but these are just small things. We're going to take a break. I'm talking to Niles Schwartz. He is my dear friend of the Twin Cities, who has taught me a great deal about cinema, and I have so wanted to hear your perspective on this film, which you have now seen twice. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. Niles, let's start with this. As a film lover and as a film historian, were there things in the film that you did not think worked, that you did not like?
There's a tendency in Christopher Nolan movies, he works very fast. This had 57 days of shooting, and there's a clumsiness, I think, to some of the dramatic exchanges, and I sort of wish that he would let a scene breathe every now and then. I mean, for example, after Jean Tatlock dies, we see Oppenheimer mourning, and Kitty coming to him and just sort of, snap out of it. This is your moment. This is, you have to do this big thing. And
get a hold of yourself here.
Yeah. And my tendency, the way I would stage that moment, is just to stay with Oppenheimer a little bit. At the same time, when I think about that and Nolan's design for the whole thing, the movie would be 4 or 5 hours long, because what he's doing is he's making a symphony. He doesn't really have all these long, drawn out scenes working up almost musically up to some sort of momentum. And I immediately fell in love with that style in his youth. To me, it was hypnotic, and I was almost in tears there, just in terms of awe. And Oppenheimer is such a depressive youth. We almost see him murder Blackett, his professor, for example, which brings up some really ominous implications for how we assess his character. This is someone who, and he has that kind of look in his eyes of, I was thinking of James Holman, the Joker killer, the person who shot a bunch of people in a movie theater in 2012, who was also a genius, apparently, a neuroscience genius who didn't get help for the schizoid disorder that he had. But it makes you think about where J. Robert Oppenheimer, this young man, this confused, lonely young man, could have gone. But he finds in the quantum mechanics something that pulverizes him, and art, the way we have him looking at a portrait of a Picasso portrait.
A nude descending a stair. I mean, there's that whole modernist little sequence there. I thought was brilliant.
We remember that it was Proust that got him out of his depressive stupor. It wasn't analysis. And it's almost as if the implication of that, as my friend Ali Arakan, a Turkish critic, pointed out, it's sort of like the bomb, and where Oppenheimer went is sort of the end result of these revolutions, this modernist revolution. And after that, we almost have postmodernism. So what I'm saying is that it didn't matter to me. The film is structurally brilliant because that momentum goes to the Trinity test, which is drawn out and is magnificent. And, the whole theater for basically 2/3 of this movie, I think, was hunched forward, just really engrossed. And then what happens after that in the gymnasium scene, which is a scene that I'd love to talk about. It's one of the best things it is the best thing that Christopher Nolan has ever done, I think.
I'm no expert on these things, but the film felt a little clumsy at times. But as you said, it doesn't matter. That's not the way that's not the way you apprehend this film.
No, it pays off. And I mean, as I said, you work at this momentum, this crescendo with Trinity and what happens after Trinity. And then something that some viewers have complained about, some critics have complained about, is like, well, it becomes a boring thing with guys in rooms after that, which I absolutely disagree with because it's totally compelling. But what's brilliant, I think, about this cross-cutting in the third hour, between 1954 and 1959, it reminds us of how this obliterating, existential, world-changing thing is necessarily repressed in our minds. And as we get engrossed in the intrigues of these two hearings, and we are more just into the drama and the outrage of the Red Scare and things like that, it doesn't matter. We've forgotten that this fireball could come down and burn us all to bits and civilization into oblivion. And then at the end, we're sucked back into that quite brilliantly, I think. And it left me totally unsettled, as one should be. A friend of mine told me that she was in tears at the end and she didn't know why. And I love when a movie can do that.
Apropos of the end, so there's this sort of key flashback scene where Oppenheimer encounters Albert Einstein at a pond at the Institute for Advanced Studies, and they have an exchange, and Louis Strauss is approaching them, and he doesn't know what they're talking about, but he assumes it's about him, and then Einstein appears to snub him as he walks by. And so this is part of Nolan's suggestion that Strauss had it in for Oppenheimer almost from the beginning, that he somehow felt that Oppenheimer was his enemy or undermining him. Turns out it wasn't true, that what Oppenheimer did say to Einstein was this. You remember when we talked about the fact that this thing could ignite the atmosphere, this chain reaction, and that it could destroy the world, which was a brief concern in the physics of the thing. He says then, I think we have started the chain reaction. In other words, that it's inevitable that at some point a Putin is going to detonate the next one. And Oppenheimer's view was the third one will routinize this, and then all bets are off.
Yes, and what's so wonderful about that moment, or I don't know how to describe it aside from what I think is important about that as a viewer, is that when we first see that moment, it's in black and white from Strauss's point of view, played by Robert Downey Jr., and it's very fast, and it looks very perfunctory and quick, and well, obviously he rebuffed Strauss right there, and well, why did they do that? But then later when we see it in color, and that's very important, that suddenly a moment in time is in color, it's nuanced, and we're taken into the intimacy of the moment. and how private moments are different from public ones. As Oppenheimer tells his lawyer in the film, who's sort of queasy about having Kitty talk about
Lloyd Garrison, this kind of ineffectual but very nice lawyer, Lloyd Garrison.
Yeah. Garrison's sort of queasy about having Kitty talk to Rob, played by Jason Clarke. Oppenheimer says, well, no one knows anything. The only people that know about people's relationships are adolescents and fools, and you're neither. And so when we assess someone from a distance, we don't, whether it's a relationship or whether it's the inner world of a person. And Oppenheimer, what I love about him is that he's such a centripetal person. His trial, people are like, why are you being a martyr? It's almost like Socrates. There's a stoic resignation to him. What will be, will be. And I think that's an important thing to take into consideration with this movie about a guy who was, as we say nowadays, #canceled, which leads me to a very crucial and I thought magnificent scene, and that is the scene about Pot with Colonel Posh and discussing the Chevalier affair. And Posh is played by the actor Casey Affleck, who is an actor who has sort of been, again, as we say, #canceled, after he won the Academy Award for Manchester by the Sea for these allegations of sexual misconduct, I think in 2010 or 2011. And Nolan deliberately teases this bad guy, Posh. He doesn't show us to us. And when he does show him to us, the whole theater where I was gasped, basically.
Gasped because they know the story of the actor Casey Affleck and his cancellation.
Yes. And what's, I think, so fascinating about it is that Affleck plays it up. He plays it as a guy who's killed communists with his bare hands. And he is a hound dog on Oppenheimer in terms of wanting him to name names.
Yeah, so the whole man theory, is what Robbie said. You need to look at the whole man, Oppenheimer. I suppose we could say that about Casey Affleck. I mean, is his sexual behavior enough to cancel him as a significant Hollywood actor? I had forgotten all that. I'll just tell you this now, it didn't work for me. When I watch a film and I can see Casey Affleck rather than Posh, or when I can see Matt Damon rather than Groves, it's not working for me. And those are the two characters that didn't work for me, especially Groves. Damon's performance, I think he just called it in. You might disagree with me, but I thought Casey Affleck was miscast in this role. And if Nolan was casting him for all this other crap that's going on in Hollywood, then I think that's almost a narcissistic thing to do.
I don't think that's why he cast him, but that's what it worked on me in that way. I just thought it was a classic character actor performance.
Let's talk about Matt Damon. I wanted so much more from Groves. Groves is an SOB. I mean, a genuine SOB. One of the people who worked with him said he's the greatest SOB I worked with, but he is an SOB. He's a bully. He's irascible. He's irrational. He strikes out. He's mean-spirited. He's cruel. He's brilliant, and he was essential to holding this project together. But I felt that Matt Damon was too likable and too sympathetic.
I mean, I think if we had probably another half hour of the movie may have come out in that character. I mean, I thought Damon's rendition of Groves was good for the film. And he's someone who could be kind of a jerk, but at the same time, someone who liked Oppenheimer. And if we're seeing the movie from Oppenheimer's perspective, and we basically are, I thought that he was basically a guy who you didn't want to ruffle their feathers too much, but at the same time, this guy likes me, I like him. And Damon gives kind of a classic movie star performance. In a way, he's sort of an anchor.
He is a movie star. That's it, exactly. That he gave a movie star's performance. I thought Kenneth Branagh was going to do that too, and he surprised me. Did any of the acting not work for you in the film?
Strangely enough, I was going to say Branagh almost didn't work for me. I mean, I thought Branagh was just doing kind of a walk-on, and Nolan likes Branagh. They worked together on Dunkirk and Tenet, and I thought did good work. But again, I thought Branagh was a good anchor. He's, Oppenheimer's god, Niels Bohr, and he doesn't have to do much. I mean, I thought I heard, Branagh's accent slip a couple times, but it didn't bother me. I mean, a lot of people complained about Gary Oldman, who plays Harry Truman. I'm curious what you think about that scene. That scene I thought was very interesting because the first time I saw the movie, I thought that Truman was being very dismissive of Oppenheimer. The second time I saw it, I saw the darkness in Oldman's eyes. This is a guy who played Sid Vicious and Joe Orton and Dracula and Lee Harvey Oswald. And I saw a lot more ambivalence there, like a guy who maybe Oldman was like, look, I dropped the bomb on these people, and this is on my heart, this burden. It's not your thing. This is my thing. So don't tell me.
I agree with that. So it's very historically accurate. So when I perform as Oppenheimer, as I will be doing in about 10 days in Vail, Colorado, I start with that. War's over. Oppenheimer's wanting to figure out some sort of non-proliferation or international agreements, maybe share this information with the world. That was Niels Bohr's view too, that our only chance was to share the information and not monopolize it. And so he thinks that Truman is not really even understanding. He looked down on Truman because Truman was a haberdasher, and he'd been an FDR guy, and Truman only learned about the bomb on the day that he took the oath of office. He had never even heard of it before as the vice president of the United States. So there's this meeting, and Oppenheimer says, after all, I have blood on my hands. And at that point you see, and I thought this was brilliant acting, I want your perspective, but you watch Oldman pull back and stiffen in a really powerful way, and then he ends the meeting almost immediately. And so
that's where Oldman turns. At first he's very affected and theatrical, and then suddenly when Oppenheimer says that, I have blood on my hands, that's when things change on a dime, and he leans back, and that's where I see that darkness and in the room. That's where, to me, the scene became a lot more ambiguous and interesting.
I liked it more the second time for exactly the same reasons that you did, Niles. And what I thought was this, that Nolan has the capacity to let the ambiguities kind of stew around a little bit so that he doesn't make it too clean. Several friends of mine have said that the music bombarded them in a way that actually disturbed them, that it was too much. It certainly is a bombarding score. What do you make of the score?
I agree with that, actually. And, when I talk about Nolan's clumsiness, my qualifiers for my enthusiasm for the movie were I would let some scenes breathe and I would take the music out a little bit. At the same time, that's what Nolan does. That's him. And in the end, it works, because when he does take the music out later on in the movie in a couple moments, there's magnificent sound work. By having music everywhere else, when you have it where it's not there, it's more efficacious. I agree with that criticism of the movie, and if it was me and not Christopher Nolan in charge.
Several times in the film you hear this kind of stomping on the wood, and it builds in a crescendo, and it's very intense and very disturbing in a certain way. And there are times when you're hearing that when it's not actually related to people stomping on some barracks or in the stands. So
it sounds like a train.
Yeah, it sounds like an inevitability that this momentum is building, and I think that was very effective. And it's meant to be disturbing, right? I mean, if the soundtrack doesn't disturb you in this movie, it hasn't been a good soundtrack.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up that, when I talk about it, it's a train, and that's sort of almost in terms of looking at this movie in the light of genre. It's the Iron Horse, but it's the uranium horse, and this aspect of the Western, building the town of Los Alamos is a lot like building the town of Cheyenne for the trans.
Oppenheimer on his horse, like the sheriff riding around, and
he comes into that place, into that the gadgets effect on civilization, which is a meeting that the scientists are having. He comes in out of the rain like Clint Eastwood in Unforgiven, like William Money, and he's like, "We're gonna drop this thing because the world needs to see what this can do." So it does evoke the Western in all these moments. And then but bring it back to the sound and the thundering, that train sound. That's what it sounds like. And you realize that it's the stomping in this gymnasium, and where Oppenheimer's giving a speech, and he's saying, "I bet the Japanese didn't like what we accomplished here," and that's greeted with silence. We see the people screaming, but we hear a little girl scream just before it cuts out, and then the walls are shaking in the background. And what's happening here? It reminds me of the great sound and film editor Walter Murch, who did work for Coppola and the Godfather trilogy, Apocalypse Now, and The Conversation, and the expressive way that he would use sound to draw you into this almost, we want to say quantum world, the hidden world within a scene. And what happened there, you suddenly cut to this blinding light, like a nuclear blast, and you see a close up of a woman, a young girl, who's played by Nolan's daughter, by the way, whose skin is molting. And it's not grotesque, but it is absolutely horrifying. And to me, a lot of people have been complaining about this movie because it doesn't show the effect of the bomb. I think the dissociation from the effect of what is happening versus kind of the psychological knowledge about what's happening, that gestalt, that is what actually makes the movie more effective. And to have just cut to say what what happened in Hiroshima may have undermined the power of the movie as a whole. And there are other movies you could see that do show the destructiveness of the bomb, like Hiroshima Mon Amour or Kurosawa's I Live in Fear or something like that.
Niles, we need to take another break. I'm enjoying this conversation very much. When we come back, I want to ask you about the gymnasium scene, which we've touched on a couple of times. I want to talk about Emily Blunt in the incredible scene that she has at the end of the film. I want to talk about, of course, the star, Cillian Murphy, and I want to talk about Robert Downey Jr. Listening to a special edition of Listening to America. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of Listening to America. I'm with my friend Niles Schwartz. Let me just go straight to Emily Blunt. I've watched some of her films. Kitty Oppenheimer was a complicated woman. She was an alcoholic. She had a lot of anger, a marriage that was lots of tension. She was aware that there were other women in his world, both from the past and during the Manhattan Project. A couple of scenes where she's clearly drunk. It's hard to like Kitty Oppenheimer, but in the end, when Roger Robb is going after her, I think this is so brilliantly done. At first, she's sort of choked up and can't speak, and it's not clear she's going to be a successful witness at all. And then suddenly, Niles, she comes alive in a kind of controlled rage. And I thought that was one of the great moments in the film. What did you think?
It's what we call ownage in movie speak, which is what, it's the great cathartic moment, because to use pro wrestling lingo, it's a hot tag that we've been waiting for. And Kitty Oppenheimer, who's mainly been stifled throughout this whole movie, when Kitty comes through there at the end and just owns Roger Robb, her own rhetorical brilliance, addressing how silly this is in terms of how memory works. Was I a communist? I didn't like the way you phrased it incorrectly. That kind of thing, where she's really deconstructing this bulldog's own language. Again, back to the structure of the film and the way, the momentum of it all. That is kind of the release and victory, and it's coupled with Strauss's defeat. And we'll talk about Downey soon, but yes, Blunt is perfect for that, that moment. It pays off. That will get her a nomination.
It was a masterful moment, both by the director and by Emily Blunt. I asked John Gallons how many takes there were, and he said, I think there were only 3 on that one.
Nolan doesn't do a lot of takes.
They were all in the room. You heard John Gowan saying he kept them all in the room so that they could build up the tension. It was a small room, and if you imagine all the equipment that has to be in there for 70 millimeter, it's amazing. I bet it was even more claustrophobic for those who were sitting in there. Here's an interesting thing, your perspective and my perspective. I don't follow film the way you do. So I'm looking at the film sort of in a naive way. You have this kind of complicated set of layers. You've seen them in other things. You know their signatures. You know how they their range of emotion. That enriches it for you. Really makes it a complicated thing, a phenomenon. It's way more than just a film with its narrative lines, right?
There's also just the whole tension of reality versus drama, and mimesis, the representation of reality on the screen, and the compromises that must be made, and the manners and stylizations that go into that. And I know a historian such as yourself has to be frustrated constantly.
Of course. I expected to be shaking my fist at the screen. I didn't. It's astonishingly accurate from a historical point of view. I have a new piece on it that I'll send you. I quibble with a couple of things, and one of them is with the argument. Oppenheimer, in some sense, self-destructed so that he would be martyred before he had to face the implications of how the atomic devices were going to be used in the Cold War and beyond. And I think that that's something of a stretch. I knew you caught the Dr. Strangelove moment with the suntan lotion and the goggles on Edward Teller, right? I mean, it was over the top, and it's true, he did put on suntan lotion, but it is clearly a tribute to Dr. Strangelove.
The Strangelovian element of him as he's smiling.
He does a kind of a wow. Remember, he's like, wow.
And there's almost something perverse to it. He's like almost nodding. Of course, he reminded me of Dr. Strangelove. And Teller inspired the Walter Matthau character in Failsafe also.
I like that. Matthau was terrific in Failsafe. One of his best performances, I think. It's going to be nominated for a gazillion different things. Does it win?
It probably wins cinematography and sound. I would give it, say, score. It'll be up there for, things like production design and costumes. I think Nolan's adapted screenplay, Blunt, Downey Jr., Murphy, Nolan as director and picture.
All right, so let's go to Cillian Murphy. He'll certainly be nominated. He might win. Maybe not. I'm not sure about that. Assess his acting and tell me the scenes where you loved it most.
I have to say, I mean, a lot of people have brought up the close-ups of him and his wandering eyes. And if you have an actor who could draw you in like that, and Nolan is working with Murphy here in such a beautiful way by emphasizing these close-ups where you have a guy who has a centripetal mode of thought where he's always, there's this hidden world going that he sees and that he's feeling. And by using the close-up in almost a John Fordian way, you see kind of this terrain in Cillian Murphy's eyes. And the way that he will approach someone and talk to someone, I think a lot of people would consider Oppenheimer to be almost on the spectrum. Whether that's true or not, I don't know and I don't care, but there is something oblique about how he approaches people and talks to people. His body language, his mannerisms, they're all perfectly modulated.
If you had to predict, do you think he wins?
At this stage, yes. I mean, I'm happy that, he's not. I know a lot of people know who Cillian Murphy is. He's been in obviously a lot of movies. He's rarely been the lead, certainly in a movie this big. He might be the front runner. I know that, DiCaprio in Flower Moon and, Adam Driver in Ferrari, Michael Mann's Ferrari. And so he'll have competition. But again, people have seen Oppenheimer. And I'm not sure how many people will have seen those movies, at least in the numbers. This movie will make probably 250 million domestic.
Let's go to that scene in the gymnasium. The bomb has been made. It's been successfully tested. He's waiting, which I was startled by. But of course, no media, no CNN. So he's waiting to know what happened at Hiroshima. And he's annoyed that he's not hearing. They say turn on the radio. Turns out that the bomb, of course, was successful. And he goes into this meeting, and I know I just read this again today. Instead of coming in the front door, he decides to come in the back door in a big dramatic way. People are cheering and Oppie, 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 waiting for him. They go nuts when he comes in. He stands up, and he says those really stark things like, I bet the Japanese didn't like this, and I wish we'd had it in time for the Germans. And at that point, they go sort of into a release, I think. Going back to what you said earlier in this conversation, the only way you come to terms with this thing is some sort of cathartic laughter, crying, nervous breakdown, alters your life. But everyone has to come to terms with the fact that they have created this incredibly successful thing with an enormous esprit de corps, which also evaporated almost 100,000 people instantaneously in the Japanese city of Hiroshima. And so they're all going to live with this in one way or another for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it becomes this very perverse moment where he sees, people are laughing and crying simultaneously. It's a world of paradox. That we see a couple doing something sexual underneath the stairs. So there's almost something perverse about this, and then this guy is vomiting outside, like Oppenheimer, as played by Murphy in that scene. We're sort of, well, is this a moment of jubilation or of devastation and annihilation? The sex underneath the stand suggests creation, procreation, and everything else. Stepping on this ashen corpse suggests something quite the contrary. I mean, the movie begins with these ripples on water of raindrops, and then it ends with ripples of fire on the planet Earth. But this movie is all about theory versus what's real. And as viewers, cinema is all about seeing the impossible and then going home and speculating on it from there. And that's why I love the lacunae in the movie, the stuff that's not explained to us, because just as we're thinking about global annihilation, we're also thinking about Ruth Tolman, we're thinking about the hidden world of Kitty and Oppie and Jean Tatlock, Chevalier's relationship to Oppenheimer. I mean, it's really that, back to the Posh scene. What's really interesting about that is we never see Oppenheimer say Chevalier's name, name the name. And it's almost like he can't admit to himself that he has named the name. It's sort of like when you've done something bad in your life, whether it's infidelity or, betraying a friend. It's something that you don't want to address and face in the mirror. That's what I love about Murphy's performance, is that kind of ambivalence is there.
My view of this has been for years is that Oppenheimer was too fully realized as a complete human being to live in the Cold War. That the Cold War needed a much more simpleton kind of view, or like a Darth Vader figure like Edward Teller, but it couldn't stand a fully realized human being, because a fully realized human being can't live with the thought that we've done this, right? That we've opened up the stuff of the stars and potentially could eliminate humanity and may still. It seems to me that that's the genius of Oppenheimer. That's also why he had to fall, right?
Yeah. And Strauss's world is black and white, as Henry David Smith, who told Strauss, the difference between you and me is that you see the world in black and white and I see it in gray.
So let's go to Robert Downey Jr. I've been watching him all my life. I'm fascinated by him because he's had such a complicated life himself. I was stunned by his performance. I think that he will certainly win Best Supporting Actor. I think there's no question about that. I think it's possibly, but you'll tell me what, I think it's maybe the greatest performance of his career. I think it's frankly the greatest performance in the film. There's a scene when he comes apart after it becomes clear that he's maybe not going to get approved. I almost was wanting to hide. The intensity was so great. What did you think?
Yeah, the world is collapsing around him, and the energy that he's, this stuffed shirt. I mean, Admiral, who's not really a military guy and a scientist, or he's involved in science, but he's not a science guy. He's just a bureaucrat. He's just a stuffed shirt. And he's
a self-made man who got very powerful.
Self-made man like Oppenheimer's father. But he's just all about surfaces, all about public presentation. And then when it hits him that I'm not going to get it, it's just animal comes out, and it climaxes really with that smile about which I spoke.
When he has to face the reporters.
And that's like a trademark Downey Jr. smile, and I think that's a perfect capstone for, his man, the actor whose career has gone up and down, from, less than zero and Shortcuts and Natural Born Killers, and then his drug problems, and then reascending with Zodiac, where he's magnificent, and Tropic Thunder, and then he had the wonderful turn in Iron Man.
Am I overpraising this performance?
No, this is a perfect antagonist. I was so happy because the marketing of Oppenheimer was great, because if you just saw the trailers for Oppenheimer, you would have thought it's all set in Los Alamos. And I wanted Strauss, because, reading American Prometheus, yeah, he's not a big part of it, but he's a perfect heel. He's a perfect antagonist, a perfect foil. And I find the Red Scare stuff to be really, really engrossing, really fascinating. And him fulfilling that and Nolan not only just featuring him as much as he did, but making him kind of the second, the antipode to Oppenheimer. And the movie begins with section 1 is fission, and that's Oppenheimer's point of view in color, and section 2 is fusion, and that's Strauss's point of view, and that's in black and white. And I was so happy that we had that much of Strauss. And yeah, it is a great performance. I think that he will be rewarded for it. We will see, though people are saying, and this is a whole other conversation, that Ryan Gosling as Ken in Barbie is going to give him a run for his money. And I will say that Gosling is terrific in Barbie. I didn't like the movie, but I love Ken.
Did you see them both on the same day?
I did. The second day, I saw Oppie in the afternoon, and then I thought about it, and I thought, okay, I'll just get this over with. And I saw Barbie in the evening, and Barbie didn't play that well for me. It didn't land. It felt like a 100-minute SNL sketch. And I like Greta Gerwig's other films, but there was some great stuff in it, and, some great homages to Singing in the Rain and Vincent Minnelli's American in Paris and things like that. And Gosling as Ken was terrific. He stole the movie, and when he's not on, Margot Robbie's great, but the movie itself didn't land that well for me.
I will see it, of course. I refused to see it in the fusion, this marketing fusion, but my daughter said that I made a terrible mistake. But so let me ask you this question. So we're almost out of time, and I'm so sorry. We could talk for hours, but and we will. But people are always already saying this is the film of the century. This will be one of the greatest films. This will rank with and words like Citizen Kane come up and so on. The minute I heard all that, I thought I got to do a reality check with Niles on this. It's impossible to know, of course, but what do you think this film winds up being in the canon?
I can't really say as of yet. I will say that I'm plugged into the terrain known as film Twitter or film X or J or whatever. A lot of these people don't like Christopher Nolan and have never liked Christopher Nolan, but they like and even love this movie. It still has its critics, but just the reception to this, the rapturous reception, and from audiences, general audiences who would not like a movie like this normally, have or really think it's terrific. And historians seem to like it a lot. I can't say if it's going to be in the canon, but I will say that I totally think it's a 4-star, excellent, if not perfect, but nothing's perfect, but an excellent film. And ultimately, I have to say I loved it. And so it's
what is it that average people are going to go to this and they love it? It's a complex story. It's one that most people don't know really anything about. Who's Louis Strauss? Who's Leslie Groves? This is not a household kind of story. Everyone knows there's an atomic bomb. Most people have heard of a guy named J. Robert Oppenheimer. Some people think, oh yeah, he had a fall or something, or he was a security risk. What is it about this film that's grabbing the attention of the American people at this time?
Much as I and even though I have to reiterate that it doesn't show the effects of the atomic bomb, the gravity of the bomb comes through perfectly in the movie. And I think that's enough. And maybe there are other tangential reasons, like this has become kind of a cultural war movie along with Barbie, where the conservatives and the hammer and sickle leftists are complaining about certain things. And and I plague on both their houses as far as I'm concerned. But I think that Nolan did such a good job of directing it, and we are just drawn into Cillian Murphy's perspective that when this train starts to leave the station early in the movie, we're with it. And by we, I mean general audiences and more highbrow audiences in some cases. And, when a film can do that, that's success. Thumbs up.
Niles Schwartz, there are movies, there's film, and there's cinema, and I like it. You like all three branches of this. How can people follow you? Where can they see your work?
They could follow me on Twitter, though I'm not that great a tweeter. or on again X, whatever. Niles Files is my handle, or no, maybe it's just look me up, Niles Schwartz, and you'll be able to find me. And then I have a Substack, nilesschwartz.substack.com, where I haven't really written a lot of new criticism lately. I plan to have a piece on Oppenheimer at thepointmag.com within the next few weeks. Slowly bringing all my past writing to this Substack. So we'll see. Since the pandemic happened, I've sort of been in retirement.
I sure appreciate your perspective here today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you all next week for another important edition of Listening to America.